Hello, my name is Amy Natsky. Welcome to my channel. This is the second video of excerpts from the book The Pastor's Wife by SABINA WURMBRAND. At this point in her story, Sabina's husband Richard has disappeared into the Gulag, and Sabina also has been arrested and is being held in the transit prison camp of Jilava in Romania, and from here she'll be taken to a work camp on the Danube River. Across the gangway, in the bunk opposite mine, was Mrs. Ionid. Her son was in the mountains with Colonel Arnaseku's Marquis. Her two daughters were also in jail, one in Mislia and the other with us in Jilava, but in an adjoining cell. The mother saw her daughter walking in the exercise yard. She had scratched a tiny peephole in the painted-out window. Anyone caught near it was immediately punished, but 60-year-old Mrs. Ionid was prepared to take any risk for this glimpse of her youngest child. As she gazed, tears ran down her face. Sometimes she clambered painfully up to my bunk and talked of her husband and children. She asked about Richard, who was known to many prisoners by name. How did we first meet? Was he always a pastor? A Jew converted to Christianity? Wasn't that rather rare? It's a long story, I said, and sad and bad at times, as well as happy. I hadn't until now allowed myself to go so far back in memory, but Mrs. Ionid listened so quietly, sitting in the drab light, her lined face in shadow, that I seemed almost to be talking to myself. From time to time she would murmur, "Yes," or make a small exclamation of surprise at what I had to agree was a strange story. It began with our first meeting. Richard was 27, and I was 4 years younger. I turned into a street in Bucharest where the Wurmbrands lived. An uncle of mine was a regular calling there, and I accompanied him for the first time. I looked up at the house. There was a young man standing on the balcony and wearing such an angry expression that I almost turned back. Seeing my uncle, he waved and came down. When the greetings and introductions were over, he told me bluntly why he had been looking so cross. "My mother is nagging me to get married. She has the very girl, an heiress with a family business, 2 houses, and $1 million dowry." "It sounds very nice." "Yes, I don't mind having the business and the inheritance," he laughed. "It's the girl I don't like. But mother says it's the best way if I want us all to be rich. And I came out on the balcony and saw you." He added jokingly, "The thought came into my mind that if I could have a girl like you, I wouldn't care about the million." I didn't go back to Paris. I took a job in Bucharest, and we met every evening. Richard and I found that we had everything in common. Both of us had been poor as children. Both of us were Jews who'd put aside our religion. Richard was an up-and-coming businessman, using his keen wits to make good money for the first time. He enjoyed spending it, and we went together to nightclubs and theaters and didn't think too much about tomorrow. Yet something made him say one evening, "I'm not an easy person. You would suffer a lot with me." But we were too deeply in love to think of anything else. We had a religious wedding. The wine glass was smashed on the floor in the traditional way. It was meant to remind us of Jerusalem trodden under the feet of the Gentiles. Happiness lasted less than a year. Then Richard developed an annoying cough. He came back from the doctor white-faced. It was tuberculosis. There was a patch on one lung. He must go into a sanatorium at once. At that time, TB was a lingering disease which often proved fatal. I felt as if Richard had been sentenced to death. It seemed the worst tragedy of my life, a cruel and horrible trick which was being played on me at my moment of greatest happiness. When Richard left for the mountain sanatorium, I went to live with his mother. She was kind, but many nights I cried myself to sleep. Every fortnight I went by train to visit him. The place was beautiful, calm, with great views across hills and valleys covered with green woods. Richard, after a time, seemed almost content there. He said, "For the first time in my life, I'm resting." He seemed thankful and grew better, but a strange change was coming over him. "I've been thinking about the past, all the people I've harmed, my mother, and many girls you don't know about. I've thought only about myself. "Don't grieve about it," I said. "I've also lived such a life. This is youth." One day I found him reading a book given to him by a woman patient in the sanatorium. "It's about the brothers Rattled," he said. "They found it in order to convert Jews. Others have been praying for me while I waste my life." He talked about Jesus Christ. It was the greatest shock he could have given me. In Orthodox Jewish families like mine, it was forbidden at that time to mention Christ's name. We had to look away when we passed a church. I'd outgrown my strict Jewish upbringing, I thought, but that Richard should even think about such things upset me terribly. I knew all the history of Christian persecution of my people, how Jews were forcibly baptized, and how they had killed their own children and then themselves in thousands rather than change their religion, how they were forced to listen to Catholic masses and stopped their ears with wax to avoid hearing what they considered blasphemy. And what we saw around us was not encouraging. The Orthodox Church was strongly anti-Semitic. So was the Lutheran. The biggest anti-Semite body in the country was called the National Christian Defense League, and its chief activity seemed to consist in beating Jewish students and smashing Jewish shops. So I couldn't see what, in past or present, might persuade Richard to turn Christian. No one had ever explained to me what it was really about. Richard grew slowly better. I tried to talk to him about the good times we'd had when he got back to Bucharest. He tried to tell me about his discovery of the New Testament, which told the life of Christ. Before, we hadn't thought of having children, but now Richard was talking about how we should bring them up. He convalesced in a mountain village, and an uncanny thing happened there. An old man, a carpenter, passed the time of day with us. When he heard that Richard was a Jew, his eyes lit up with excitement. Putting a rough hand on his arm, he made this little speech. "I ask God to grant me one favor at the end of my life. Because Christ was a Jew, I wanted to bring a Jew to him, and since there are none here, and I cannot leave the village, God must send me one. And here you are, in answer to my prayer." Richard was deeply moved, but my heart sank. Before we left, the carpenter gave him a worn Bible, saying, "My wife and I have prayed for hours over this, asking for your conversion." Richard read and read in it. I didn't know what to do. I was utterly dismayed. Few outsiders can guess how strong a hold anti-Christian feelings may have on a Jewish heart. Besides the historical reasons, there were nearly always personal ones. As a child, I had to walk home from school past a corner where two bigger girls lay in wait to pull my hair, because, they said, "You're a dirty little Jewess." And they were Christians. It was a game of a kind. And then, when I grew up, the Nazi persecution of Jews in Germany began. Richard told me that Jesus himself was a victim of injustice, but I couldn't bear to hear that forbidden name on his lips. "I don't need him," I said. "You don't need him. It isn't natural. We're Jewish. It's another way of life." And when he spoke of being baptized, I quite lost my head. "I'd rather die than see you become a Christian. It isn't natural." I said that if he had to have religion, he could practice his own Jewish faith, and for a time he did. He went to the synagogue, but even there he talked about Christ. Then he persuaded me, frightened but also a little curious, to look inside a church. It was full of pictures of the saints, and he showed me that half of them were Jews, as were Jesus and his Holy Mother Mary. The commandments taught to every child were those of the Jewish Book of Moses. The Psalms were the Jewish Psalms of King David. The Old Testament was full of arguments and prophecies about Christ. "The fact is," said Richard, as he led me around the strange vaulted building, "that the Christian religion is simply our Jewish faith opened to all the nations of the earth." Who made it possible that Jewish values, morals, and wisdom should prevail throughout the world, should reach to so many hundreds of millions over 2,000 years? Only Christ could have done it. Because of his work, the holy book of the Jews had been translated from Hebrew into 1,000 languages and dialects, and now the Bible was read by ignorant peasants and by the greatest scientists, Pasteur, Einstein. So with patient arguments over many nights, Richard wore down my objections. I read the New Testament. I admired and loved the Savior, but I felt in sympathy with Gandhi when he said, "From Christianity, give me Christ, and you can keep all the rest." I wanted nothing to do with his followers who had wronged my people. Richard wouldn't have this. You can't accept Jesus without accepting his disciples. He would not leave them to come to you. And you can't accept the disciples without calling even Judas a friend, as Jesus did. In time, my intellectual objections were overcome, but I knew that the emotional ones were still there. They grew not weaker, but stronger, for while my mind whispered, "He's right," my heart, my whole upbringing were in revolt. For weeks more, this internal struggle raged within me. One evening, Richard walked in from a prayer meeting at the Anglican Church Mission to the Jews. He took my hands in his and said he had surrendered his heart to Christ. Soon he would be baptized. I thought of myself as a tough, resilient character, but the news was more than I could bear. I shut myself alone in my room for hours, and I decided that on the day he was baptized, I would kill myself. When it came, and I was left alone, I locked my door and threw myself down on the floor, racked with dry sobs. A terrible emptiness, a windy desert, stretched away inside me. In my desperation, I cried aloud, "Jesus, I can't come to you. I don't want Richard to be yours. I can't bear any more." I shocked myself with the force of my own cry. I lay there for a long time, sobbing. And then, slowly, I grew calmer. Something had changed within me. Life began to flow back. When Richard returned from baptism, which had been done in another town, I went with flowers to meet him at the station. He was so happy, and we sat up until late at night discussing all that had happened. I saw now that I had been quietly moving towards this change with a silent force I hadn't understood, although all the while I thought my mind was in charge. But if I'd given way, I wasn't yet prepared to call myself a Christian. I was young. I wanted to go to parties and dances and cinemas, not to sit listening to sermons in churches. To humor me, sometimes Richard would agree. At a party we went to one Sunday evening, I suddenly realized that I was not enjoying myself in the least. The noise and the drink and the smoke and the jokes grew worse, and everything about the conversation was either boring or disgusting. My thoughts were no longer there. I said to Richard, "Can't we leave?" To my surprise, he said it would be rude to go so early. Reading my mind, he kept me there on one pretext or another, until I felt sick of the whole thing, until I felt almost physically unclean. Very late, as we were going home, I said impulsively, "Richard, I'd like to be baptized at once." He smiled. "You've waited a long time. Let's wait now until tomorrow." He took me next day to meet his new friends from the Anglican mission, Pastor Adensi, a saintly man, and Pastor Ellison, who also seemed to me to belong to another world. Both had given up everything for their ministry, and from them I learnt a Christianity that meant sacrifice and self-renunciation. I was overflowing with such happiness that I had to share it. On the day after my baptism, I hurried to work and told a friend, a Jewish girl, never doubting that she'd be won over too. I'd forgotten already what I'd been through myself. But the more I said about my change of heart, the less she wished to hear. "So now I've lost you," she said, and turned away weeping. We'd been very close. It was only the first lesson. After my conversion, we had a child. We hadn't wanted children in the past, fearing that they'd interfere with our gay life. Our son Mihai was born in 1939. Already the darkest clouds were gathered over Romania. We were in Hitler's orbit, and we knew that Jews must soon be uprooted. So everything in reason pointed against having a child. But we had Mihai. How glad we are today to have him. Richard's mother was almost as proud as we were. On the first day she hurried to tell all the relations, "The very image of Richard, and so intelligent." Richard told me, "He's dark like you and very beautiful, but he only cries. When will he say something clever? We were so happy. By the time I had finished my story, the evening was almost gone. Around the cell, quarrels and arguments were taking their inevitable course. Arms and gesturing hands cast an embroidery of shadows on the ceiling, and the cell hummed like an angry hive as women settled slowly in for the night. We're going to pick up the story after Sabina has been transferred to a work camp in Chernovoda on the Danube River. This is about a year later. In 1951, more and more communist women began appearing in the camps and prisons. At Chernovoda, I met Mariora Dragoescu, who'd been imprisoned by the old regime as a leading revolutionary. Now she was sent to forced labor by her comrades as a counter-revolutionary. But she would go on fighting for the communist ideal. The great Marxist society was around the corner. In Myslia, the big women's prison, she had nursed her 2-month-old child. Then it had been taken from her and put in a state orphanage. She didn't know if she'd ever see it again. She'd commiserated with George Curtescu, one of the party founders, who'd served his first prison sentence for socialism in 1907. He'd also been the first Secretary General of the Communist Party. Now, at 72, he worked alongside us in the fields from sunrise to sunset, in snow, rain, and wind. Sometimes I filled his barrow with earth. He'd hitched himself to it like a beast. It was easier to pull than to push up the slopes. I remembered something Richard said shortly before his arrest and repeated it to him. Under a tyranny, prison is the most honorable place to be. A smile lit his face. A guard shouted at him, and he hurried off, yoked to his load. Next day, when we were out together, I whispered, "I'm sorry to get you into trouble with my speaking." "No, speak. It's like music to hear something different after so long. I've hungered to hear a gentle voice as I hunger for color after so much gray." Later he told me of his disillusion. "This communism they practice is not the ideal I fought and suffered for. I felt it would be dishonest on my part not to protest." Those of us who had faith realized for the first time how rich we were. The youngest Christians and the weakest had more resources to call upon than the wealthiest old ladies and the most brilliant intellectuals. People with good brains, education, wit, when deprived of their books and concerts, often seemed to dry up like indoor plants exposed to the winds. Heart and mind were empty. Mrs. Nelescu, the professor's wife from Cluj, said one day, "How happy you must be to be able to think and keep your mind busy and pray. I can't. I try to remember a poem, and in comes the guard shouting. At once my mind goes back to this everlasting camp. I can't concentrate. I can't discipline myself." Society women were often the most pitiful. Life was harder for them than for anyone. They'd lost most, in the material sense, and they had fewest inner resources to fill the gap. A rubble of old games of bridge, hats, hotels, first nights, lost weekends, and lovers rattled about in their heads like junk in the back seat of a car. Their nerves gave way first, as did their soft white hands. After work, women came to the religious prisoners and asked, begged even, to be told something of what we remembered from the Bible. The words gave hope, comfort, life. We had no Bible. We ourselves hungered for it more than bread. How I wished I'd learnt more of it by heart. But we repeated daily those passages we knew, and at night also, when we held vigils for prayer. Other Christians, like me, had deliberately committed long passages to memory, knowing that soon their turn would come for a rest. They brought riches to prison. While others quarreled and fought, we lay on our mattresses and used the Bible for prayer and meditation, and repeated its verses to ourselves through the long nights. We learned what newcomers brought and taught them what we knew. So an unwritten Bible circulated through all Romania's prisons. I'd asked everyone at the canal if they'd had word of Richard, always frightened of the wrong answer, but no one knew anything. Then 3 women arrived from Vakarest, a prison where many of the sick were taken. Every new arrival was like the coming of the postman. We asked the usual questions, hoping for news of our relatives in jail. None had heard of Richard. A few days later, a woman from this group came to me. "Every time you speak of God, I remember Vakaresht," she said. "I was only there a short time, but we had a preacher there too." Vakaresht was a converted monastery. Walls between the monks' rooms had been knocked down to make bigger cells, but a few small alcoves remained where special prisoners could be isolated. "We were waiting on the landing to use the bathroom," said the woman, "when a man was heard talking from behind a locked door. He was saying, 'Love Jesus and trust in God's kindness.' We were so surprised. Everyone in the prison asked who he was, but it was kept secret, of course." Now she had met me, she was sure it was Richard. He seemed very ill. After some days he stopped preaching. She'd heard that he had died. How many tears in secrecy streamed down my face. How the pain tore at my heart. But through this grief, hope grew. I continued to pray and ask the Lord to add years of life and health to the man who served him faithfully, even in the isolation cell. At night, in every hut, a woman had to stay awake on guard duty. What you were supposed to be guarding was never explained. I imagine it was to prevent suicides. But you had to keep on your feet. Punishments for falling asleep were brutal. A naked light bulb, dangling in the middle of the rooms, swung gently in the draught. Rows of women tossed and turned. Some snored loudly. Some cried out in nightmare. Every face showed marks of suffering and fear. How long were the hours! How desolately the wind howled outside! As if it had blown all these strangers here together, old, young, women of fashion, vagrants from under the city bridges. All they had in common was pain. When I was a child, I disliked night. Now I longed for it as the one release from murderous work. Yet when dark came, I couldn't sleep. I would rise and pray for the women in our hut, in our camp, for the millions of prisoners in the communist world, and also for Christians who slept peacefully in the West, and those I imagined were praying for us. Once, being in any case awake, I offered to take on a shift. It was Tanya's. She had no trouble sleeping, but she refused, brusquely. She said, "Sleep yourself," but meant it kindly. Later, seeing me still awake, she came to sit on my bed. We talked in whispers. She told me one of her thieves' tales. She'd been in a prison which held 4,000 women. Among them was one who had been governor of that very jail under the old regime. "She'd had a go at communist prisoners during the war," said Tanya, "and now she was inside herself, which was just where she belonged. It wasn't just that she cooked the books and pinched the food money. They all did that. But this one used to let out the smartest girls for a few days, then bring them in and take a cut of what they'd stolen." When I tried to speak to her about God, Tanya answered, "Before you reach God, the saints kill you." It was a common saying in Romania. There was no lack of outward devotion to the saints, but few had any real idea who they were. I told her that the saints help and intercede for us and really can bring us to God. Saints kill nobody. I said, 2 worlds exist, the material and the spiritual, but only in the material do the laws of God and man say, "Don't steal." In the spiritual world, steal all you can is the rule. Steal whatever knowledge, manners, wit you can. In the material world, if you steal from me, I lose. But in the spiritual world, I lose nothing. I am not against your being a thief. The trouble is that you don't know what to steal. Whatever you take today, you'll lose, if not tomorrow, at death. But wisdom and knowledge of God, once taken from somebody, you have eternally.